Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. What a great crowd we've got today. I'm excited to share with everybody about our Sand Creek site discovery and our book. So we're really just going to kind of get right into it today. And many of you already bought a book, and so you've got a book in hand. We found the Lost Sand Creek site. So we're going to get into what does that mean? What is the Lost Sand Creek site? How is it lost? What was found? How do we know? What substantiates the Lost Sand Creek site? So we're going to get into all of that today. And so we're going to talk about that. So what is the Lost Sand Creek site? It's the site my mom and dad found. It's the site where they found over 4,000 Sand Creek battle and village artifacts. And we have a small sampling of some of those artifacts with us today. And you can see some of those. Either you may have seen those on your way in. If you didn't, make sure you take a few minutes to look at them on your way out. So we've got a small sampling of artifacts you can see. So we're just going to talk about the Lost Sand Creek site. So as we look at the Lost Sand Creek site, a lot of people may have questions. Well, the Lost Sand Creek site, what's that? Because there is a historic site that's run by the National Park Service about Sand Creek. And some people will think, well, what in the world is that? That's supposed to be the right place where everything happens. So we're going to get into that today. And then that right here, I'm just going to point out a little bit. This is what people commonly refer to as that bluff at the National Parks, what's now the National Park Service Sand Creek site. And this picture is from a tour that my mom and dad did. Dad was just right out of high school, graduated in 1970. They asked him to give a presentation at the historic Sand Creek site. And at the time, this was, over 25 years before he would be finding artifacts. And so he didn't really know where he was and didn't really know as much about the stories he would end up learning. But this is that historic bluff. And we're just going to kind of think about this bluff for a minute, because this is where the story's been told, where the Indians were camped below this bluff. Well, just kind of a brief overview of that. The traditional massacre story is that these Indians were camped below this bluff. They couldn't see an approaching enemy because, they didn't have a viewpoint to do that. They were just below this bluff and couldn't see the soldiers coming, and the soldiers stormed the camp very early in the morning, right as the sun was coming up, surrounded them, killed all the Indians as they were coming out of their teepees, and identified women and children, intentionally killed those. That's what we're told. And so we're going to kind of get into that story today, and just what we know from discovery and from the Lost Sand Creek site, what we've learned from research. There's a lot of questions. So when was it lost? How do we know the site was lost? And what was found? Those are a few of the questions. So when was it lost is a very good question, because it's not really dated. It's important to note that what we know now is where there's been a historic site set up by the NPS. That site was never identified physically by an eyewitness. There's never was an eyewitness that ever went to this site and said, this is where we fought. That never happened. And so I just think that's important to note. What happened was over time, this became settled as the site because of a few main reasons. One, there's a bend that goes through there, through this area. There's a bend that goes right through there, and it matches the bend on a map that people refer to as the George Bent map. And so if you may be familiar with George Bent, he was born at Bensold Fort. He was actually at Sand Creek. He was a Cheyenne warrior. George Bent was half Cheyenne. And so he lived with Black Kettle. He was one of his warriors. He was at Sand Creek. And years later, like over 40 years after Sand Creek, while he was working in Colony, Oklahoma as an Indian agent, he wrote letters to historians, and he answered their questions about the Cheyenne life and time living at Sand Creek. And he was only at Sand Creek 3 days. But while he was living as an Indian agent, he would get information from the older Indians that would come into the agency, and they would answer his questions. Well, there was a historian named George Hyde, and George Hyde was constantly sending George Bent maps and asking him to fill in these maps. Well, over time, it got confused that the map that George Hyde sent him to fill in for Sand Creek was then referred to as the George Bent map, but it wasn't Bent's map. In fact, so here's that map, and you can see this is what they call the George Bent map. You've got fold lines on this map. You've got two different sets of handwriting, blue and black pencil. This is George Bent. He'd be filling in this information. as far as the, where camps would have been placed. So George Hyde sent him this map and asked George Bent to fill in the map. And so, but people commonly mistake it for being made by George Bent. It wasn't. It was made by historian George Hyde. But there's a few other things to point out on this map. There is no legend on this map. There's no legend whatsoever. And if you go onto like satellite imagery or anything, which we've done in doing our Sand Creek research, we have found that that bend that goes through that National Park Service site is only about 1/4 of a mile long. Well, there's a problem with that, because in a letter George Bent wrote to George Hyde, he said that the Indian villages were 2 to 3 miles long. And so this bend, this spot is much too small for the actual Sand Creek site. But when George Bent is filling this out, he doesn't know that the bend that George Hyde used, he used the USGS topo map that came out, I believe, in 1894. And he used that topo map and basically just copied the bend on that map. And he copied that bend because of a statement made by Colonel Shivington. And Colonel Shivington, he said that it was the big bend of the Sandy or the south branch of the big Sandy. And so people then just decided that what he had to have meant was it was the furthest south bend. So they chose this bend, and they settled on that because of this map. And Colonel Shivington saying the south branch of the Big Sandy, they thought it was the furthest bend to the south. And so that's important to note. The next document I'm going to get into is the what's called the Three Forks map. Lieutenant Bonsall came out in 1868, just 4 years after Sand Creek. Lieutenant Bonsall came out, and he documented there, in 4 years after Sand Creek, there would still be like burnt teepee remains. There would still be things where you could kind of measure the distance of the village. So basically what he's doing is measuring the distance of the village. He measures from a spot called Three Forks, and it's just a spot where basically just 3 trails branch off in 3 different directions. And he goes down 6 miles to their camp number 2, and he labels that 6 miles. And this is a very important map. It's just a simple strip map is all it is, but he's measuring distances. And these distances, and for him to have the presence of mind to use a physical land description like Three Forks is very important to documenting the Sand Creek site. That's very, very important. And so as things kind of go on and progress, Mom and Dad are, they're contacted. They're contacted by an independent archaeologist. In 1993, they're contacted by a man named Jim Kopke. He was an independent archaeologist, and he contacted Mom and Dad through his parents, who owned the land, and my mom and dad leased land. They had cattle out there on Sand Creek. And Jim Kopke, based on his independent work he was doing, he thought that the monument that was out at the Sand Creek, what we call the traditional Sand Creek site, he thought that monument was marking the wrong location. And according to his research, he thought the right location was further up the creek and possibly on Bowen land. So this is in 1993. So this just kind of gets the ball rolling a little bit. This is pretty important. So in 1993, they're kind of starting to chew on this information. That Sand Creek spot is possibly wrong. How could that be? And so they're thinking about this. And the Colorado Historical Society gets involved in 1993, and they do a helicopter visit looking for other bends in the creek, because they were on this idea that it had to be on this specific looking type of bend. And so they got and rode over helicopters looking for trails and bends and anything that might match that George Bent map. And so they rode over, they found some places they thought might work. They stopped at a place on the ranch, on the Bowen Ranch, they thought might work. All of their searches that day came up empty. They didn't find anything Sand Creek related that day. So 1993, it's just kind of, okay, nothing's happening, but the seed has been planted. 1994, they're still just kind of thinking about it and kind of chewing on Sand Creek. In 1995, they come to the conclusion that, okay, there's some issues here. We should probably do our own discovery and see what we can find. Because this guy thinks it's possibly on Bowen land. Is it possible? There's one way to find out. So they decide to devise a plan and come up with their own plan. And they decided that they needed to, there's 7 miles of Sand Creek that go through the ranch. There's a lot of Sand Creek. They needed to try to figure out some clues, find places to search. They decided they needed to look at eyewitness accounts. They needed to learn from people who were at Sand Creek, people that were there, that were can give a visual account of what the land looked like. That they studied eyewitness accounts looking for land descriptions, and there was a soldier named Irving Halbert. He gave the best clues. Irving Halbert gave the best clues. I'll get into some of those in just a minute. And one of those clues, though, was land description. They talk about land descriptions like where the creek banks are 200 yards wide. Well, if you're familiar with or have ever been to the National Park Service site, the creek banks are not very wide at all. They're not very wide. And so, but if you get up the creek about 1.5 miles, 2 miles up the creek, that creek really widens out. The creek widens out quite a bit, and you get to a spot, you get onto the Bowen Ranch, and there easily are banks 200 yards wide, for example. But there was a man that went out to that historic site several summers. This guy was very experienced with a metal detector. His name was Fred Warner. He wrote about his trips to the traditional Sand Creek site to search for artifacts. He was accompanied by a friend and colleague named Larry Fennell several times. Larry Fennell was also very experienced with a metal detector, and he found hundreds and hundreds of artifacts at the Summit Spring site near Sterling. And so these are people that knew what they were doing. They knew how to search with metal detectors and find stuff. But this is from Fred Warner's book. We worked a short distance upstream and then also downstream, covering at least 40 to 50 yards in width on both sides of the stream. I'm sorry to say that we found only junk items. We found no battle relics, Warner said. On another trip with Bob Larzalaire, Bob and I were a bit disappointed that we didn't find any historical relics at Sand Creek. Hopefully, on a future trip to Sand Creek, we will find some of the elusive historical relics which we feel certain are still buried. And so these are guys that were very experienced. They were very convinced that artifacts were still out there to be found. But below that bluff where that alleged attack was supposed to have happened, where the Indians were alleged to have been camped, no physical evidence has ever been, no period artifacts have never been found there. They've found, Pepsi can, soda can tabs. They found barbed wire, fence staples, things of that nature. But they never found any period artifacts. And just to name a few, that area below that bluff should have been littered, absolutely littered with artifacts, including bullets, cannonball shell fragments, the 69 caliber lead balls that went inside the shells, Borman fuses, arrowheads, kettle fragments, metal cooking utensils. That's just to name a few. There's a lot more that there would have been found too. And we're going to get into the fact that we're going to it from a site where there's no period artifacts, and we get up the creek where we're over 4,000. And so they start thinking, okay, could this be on Bowen land? And so we get ahead, they get to 1995, and in 1995, that's when they are devising their plan, and that's when Dad decides to get a metal detector. But there's some big clues that come up. From our book, we found the lost Sand Creek site. Whether we were taking a drive, eating dinner, or drinking our morning coffee, we talked about Sand Creek. One night, Sheri and I went out to eat and were talking about Colonel Shimington saying the Indians were camped at a place known as Big Bend of the Sandy. A big bend seemed to fit the traditional site. Where else could it be? I started to doodle on my napkin. I started thinking about what he said, the Big Bend of Sand Creek. In my mind, I emphasized it differently each time. The Big Bend, the Big Bend, the Big Bend. Then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Big Bend was a region, not a specific bend. There were no detailed maps of this area at the time. It hadn't been surveyed yet. In the 1860s, the vast ocean of prairie was described by regions and not specific locations. There are many bends in the creek. The Big Bend of the Arkansas River in Kansas also refers to a region. And so he came to this conclusion, this epiphany that Shimington was referring to as the Big Bend wasn't one specific small bend in Sand Creek. It was the region, a big bend of Sand Creek. And so that's important. So this epiphany is important to discovery because now he knows, okay, he already was obviously aware of 7 miles of Sand Creek going through the family ranch. But this really kind of starts to help narrow things down a little bit. I mean, there's still a region. You still have all the way from that Big Bend, this Big Bend region. It could be anywhere between Kit Carson and you're going down by the ranch, and so there's like a good 20 miles of Sand Creek, but it's starting to get narrowed down a little bit at a time. But in 1995, Dad gets a metal detector and he starts hunting, and our biggest clues came from Irving Halbert, and he said this in 1908: "At daylight in the morning, the command was 40 miles away from the fort. Just as the sun came up, the command reached the top of a ridge overlooking the valley of the Big Sandy, from which point a large Indian village could be seen scattered along the north bank of the stream about 3 miles away." And in 1925, he said a pretty similar statement: "Just as the sun was coming up over the eastern hills, we reached the top of a ridge, and away off in the valley to the northwest, we saw a great number of Indian tents, forming a village of unusual size." And so this kind of starts to shift a little bit, because it's no longer about finding a bend, it's about finding a ridge. And so this is very important as well, because we're not looking for a specific bend anymore, because now he realizes that Shivington was talking about the region, the Big Bend region of Sand Creek, but Halbert says that they reached the top of a ridge. Well, they only could find two ridges that match this description. One was that ridge, it's that same thing, it's that bluff at the National Park Service site, was that, or there was also a ridge way up the creek on the Bowen Ranch. But they kept thinking, well, it might be that ridge that is over there by. And at the time, it was just privately owned, and it was not any managed by the Park Service at the time. But that ridge seemed to fit, and he thought, well, they've got the Three Forks map, and that he measured down 6 miles, camp number 2, to Three Forks, and in that 6-mile line fragment, he marked the village. So he knows that it's in that 6-mile stretch between Three Forks and their camp number 2. So what you really need to not focus on so much is where they camped, but 6 miles down the creek from, if you can find Three Forks, that would help substantiate things. And so they have that to go off of, and if then they could measure up about a few miles up the creek from that ridge, you can kind of start to put a puzzle together. Because if you start finding artifacts in this area, it's going to really start matching what the eyewitnesses said about the event. And so things shifted, and they started looking for a ridge. Well, it's important to note, this is very important context to researching, studying, looking for artifacts with a metal detector on Sand Creek, is my dad grew up there. He was born and raised on Sand Creek. It was his backyard. Nobody knew that part of Sand Creek more than him, and nobody has spent even nearly as much time on that part of Sand Creek as him. He literally knows it like the back of his hand. And so that was an advantage. So when my mom and dad would read eyewitness accounts and look at eyewitness descriptions of land, what the land looked like, my dad would hear something, my mom would read the account, my dad would take notes, and he'd be like, I know where this is, I know where this sounds familiar, I'm familiar with this. They just start taking notes. And he would go and search these places with a metal detector. So in 1995, they start searching. It's really slow going in 1995. 1996, it is slow going still. It's really slow going. It's not finding much in 1996. And I'm sure there's probably some discouragement that started to set in, because you're over a year in and you're not finding a lot. 1997. In 1997, he started finding artifact after artifact after artifact after artifact, and he just started finding hundreds of them and hundreds. And every day he would go out, and what he'd do is he would feed his cattle, and he would metal detect and find artifacts. And for him, that was probably the most fun. He'd come home with a lot of treasures every single day. He would get a GPS coordinate of them, and he'd take a photo. It's a very meticulously documented discovery. It's very meticulously, and over time, and now we get into modern era, we can take all those GPS waypoints that he had documented, we can put them into satellite imagery, and it really starts to tell a story. You look at over 4,000 artifacts on satellite imagery and see how spread out things were. It's pretty incredible. So by 1997, they're really starting to find stuff. 1998 was a pretty important year too. And I'm going to read this from our book. By 1998, I found hundreds of period artifacts. Sheri and I felt it was the time to document our discovery. We decided to call it the Lost Sand Creek Site. We met with Merlin Rife at First National Bank in Lamar on October 29. He verified our signatures attached to the statements and artifact photos with the notary seal. We had an accompanying aerial map showing where the artifacts were found. I mapped many Indian teepee sites as well as some fight areas. We hoped it would be sufficient to document our discovery. Artifact finds include spent bullets, half a grindstone that looked like it was pierced by a bullet, a Mexican ring bit, buttons from a dress, knives, rings, jewelry, kettle parts, coffee grinder parts, cavalry spur, and harmonica reed plates. So he's had already, by 1998, they had been finding hundreds of artifacts and documented that discovery. And you can find a copy of that notary in the book that you bought earlier today. There's a copy of that notary in there that you can see. And so they decided to have that notarized. In 1998, it didn't end. In 1998, it was really still just picking up. A year later, in 1999, he would find a spot on that land with littered with artifacts that could only be from Sand Creek. They were battle artifacts. It was an only event these were ever used on this part of Colorado, and they only could be from Sand Creek. I'm not going to give that away quite yet, what those artifacts were. So you'll have to stay tuned for that. So that's important. We've learned a lot from discovery. So we're going to come back to this bluff. This bluff is important. We've learned a lot from the discovery, just simply based on the lack, and not just lack of physical evidence. There's no period artifacts found anywhere below this bluff, anywhere in this area. There's no physical evidence of period artifacts whatsoever. We've learned that also it's important to note that this would not be a good spot for a winter camp because this would block the warmth of the sun. It wouldn't just keep them from seeing an approaching enemy. It would block the warmth of the sun. And so I know that there's traditionally this story is told, it's almost like this heart-wrenching story that make us have sympathy, but we need to use some common sense too. The Indians were very smart people. They lived on the land. They knew where to make a camp. They were very smart. This would not be a good place for a winter camp for so many reasons. And you come out here now, we had a closer look at that. You kind of get zoomed out here a little bit. This is where the monument used to sit. By the way, this is what the monument looked like. If you're not aware, they took that monument down about 2 years ago. Sand Creek Battleground, November 29 and 30, 1864. That monument is no more. But you can see the monument would have been up here on this ridge. And you kind of see, I just kind of starting to give you a visual of how wide open space this is once you kind of get away from that ridge and away from that bluff. So this picture too, and here that's where the monument would be. Now we're at there's the Bowen property line. And this is a photo that we took of Dad being interviewed in the, I believe, mid-2000s for a program called Colorado Getaways. And it aired on Denver CBS 4. And they came out with their camera crew and everything, interviewed Dad. They had it on Channel 4 for Colorado Getaways. And you can see the monument's way back here. You're getting onto the Bowen property line, and you can just see how wide open this is. But we can learn, though, from discovery and from just the lack of evidence. Indians weren't camped below that bluff. The soldiers did not attack any Indians there. And then this gets even more spread out here. You can kind of see right about in here, a really important artifact discovery location in here, and kind of in here, kind of roughly around in here, and keep going. And even starting probably about in there, the village, starting a little over a mile up a creek from that village. But you can just see, and you almost have to think about this without these large trees, because there could have been some small saplings, some small trees at the time, but it would even been more wide open than this. It would have just been completely like open prairie. So now you have a spot. So not only, you're no longer at a spot where they can't see an approaching soldier, but they're actually camped at a spot where they not only could, but did see the soldiers coming. George Bent, who we talked about just a little bit ago, shared about an Indian's account, another warrior named Little Bear. And Little Bear said that he got up very early that morning before the sun came up, and he went across the creek and went up on a hill to go get his horse. Well, as he was getting his horse, he looked south toward the lodgepole trail, and he looks south and he sees a long black line. And he knew at that moment that it was soldiers on horseback coming to fight the Indians in the village. They had a several mile head start. This is all according to George Bent. This isn't our opinion, something that we've made up. This is from George Bent. He was a witness in there at Sand Creek. And so this is all according to eyewitnesses. And so, they were able to look towards that ridge, and that ridge goes across here. He looks south toward that lodgepole trail, and he sees a long black line. And so they knew the soldiers were coming. And so that's where I come back to that bluff. It's still very important. That bluff where they say the Indians were camped, it's not where they were camped. That bluff is still important. But that bluff is where the soldiers rode up and they first saw the Indian village. But the Indian village wasn't right below them. It was about 2 miles up the creek from there almost, and stretching for about 2 to 3 miles. It was a very large Indian camp. And so that bluff is still important. It's just simply for a different reason. It's where they first saw the Indians. And so that's important. And it's also important, we learned through discovery, that at Sand Creek, a lot of soldiers whose testimony has just been almost erased from history, is that a lot of soldiers have testified or written about Sand Creek and said it was the hardest fought battle they'd ever been in, and they had fought in a lot of wars. And one soldier even saying he had lived among the Indians for 7 years, and he was very well accustomed to them and fought in a lot of battles. So it was the hardest fought battle they were in, and it's well documented. There were over 70 soldier casualties at Sand Creek. And so we're told that through this massacre account that it was just women, children, and elderly that were unarmed. But we have to look at facts. We have to look at everything that happened. Over 70 soldiers, either killed or wounded on the battlefield. There was a fight. There were warriors in the camp. Dad actually found a skirmish area that we believe was where soldier Robert McFarland was killed. And all of this is documented. We have blogs on this stuff. You can find Robert McFarland on our website. We found that skirmish area he believes was Robert McFarland, where he was killed by an Indian warrior in hand-to-hand combat. And so there's a lot of things that happened at Sand Creek. There's a lot of layers to it. A lot of people aren't aware that there were 3 hearings following Sand Creek, but there was never a trial. Shivington was actually denied witnesses. Shivington tried to have witnesses come testify on him. And he actually ended up writing what was called the synopsis of the Sand Creek investigation. And so many soldiers testified for that. It's just we want to throw out all of the information, and so that people can look at everything and then make a logical, educated decision on what you think about Sand Creek based on all of the evidence, when most of the evidence hasn't ever been presented. And so we think that's important to share everything. As far as a lot of the stories, they've just never been told. And we've talked about artifacts and things that have been found. So I'm going to invite Joe to come up here in just a minute, and he's going to come talk to you about, he's gone metal detecting with Dad for over 20 years. He's been gone out there. He's found some really cool stuff.
It's my turn a little bit. Mine is more of the fun part. When Chuck and I metal detect, as a rule, we put down a flag and we walk forward metal detecting. We get to a certain point, scoot over, put another flag, and come back. So we go, so we go up and back, so we don't go everywhere. And for your information, those people, you guys that have the books, chapter 10, me. So make sure you look at it. As a rule, when I'm out there, I don't know what anything is. And Chuck knows everything. The first thing I ever found that I thought, oh my gosh, what's going on? It was this spur, and it was about yay deep. And I'm thinking, man, who lost this? Now, I'm not very good on a horse, and honestly, I don't know a horse from a cow. But I know if you're going to ride something, you need to have something to help you get the horse to go. And I thought, God, who lost this? Was he being chased? Was somebody shooting at him? Did he fall off the horse? And if these, and it's just a little hunk of metal, but what story? And how long did it take to get buried so deep that Anyway, this little thing just made my mind just spin. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then Chuck and I had went out one day, and we didn't find anything. Sorry, I'm moving everywhere. I'm an old teacher and I move around, so you better be good, okay? So we stood on a by each other, and there was a little cow path, and it was about that big, and Chuck's metal detector went off. So I dug down, and lo and behold, I found this, and it would fit on a dime. And I see everyone squinting. It's a little metal star, and what's going on? And then I said, Chuck, what is this? And immediately he said, oh, star tobacco. What are you talking about? So in today's era, when people chew tobacco, it's usually in a little can, and you can tell because the guy's butt has a circle on it. Well, back then, the tobacco of choice was in a cube and it was wrapped up, and it was called star tobacco. Hang on. Star tobacco. And that was the emblem, and people knew what that was. And only Chuck would know what that was. And I was amazed. Other things that we had found, and these are little tinklets for decoration. What happened? Was she running? Did she fall? Did she just drop them? Did they just fall off? Did the wind blow? I don't know, but we found some little tinklets. The last thing was, and I'm almost done, so hang on. We were going out to Sand Creek, and on Chuck's dash was this hunk of metal. What on earth is this thing? And oh, this is it. It's not very big. It fits in my hand, but it's heavy for no bigger than it is. And I thought, oh my gosh. And Chuck proceeded to tell me that it was a cannonball. And, oh my gosh. If this thing would hit you, it would rip you to pieces. And I'm after this, you'll be up here. You can hold it. It's heavy. And okay, so we put it back, and we go metal detecting, and we pull up, and Chuck says, "Do you see that green post?" And in reality, that green post was like from here to the car across the street. He said, "That's where I found that cannonball." Wow. So we're metal detecting. Remember, we go up and back, and my metal detector goes off. I dig down, and actually it was fairly deep. And oh my gosh, I know what something is. I finally found something that I know what it is. And I pick this thing up, and lo and behold, and Chuck, come here. And he comes over, and Michael said, everything we find, it's GPS plotted. I mean, I guarantee you, Chuck can take you to the exact spot he found this. And man, I was so proud of myself because I knew what this was. This was mine, and I found it. So Chuck, as always, has a nail belt. You guys know what I'm talking about. And he puts stuff in his nail belt. So we're on our way home. And I said, Chuck, could I please see that piece I found? He got it. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, they match. And oh my gosh, I'm fooling with them. And all of a sudden, poof, they fit together. They fit together perfect. And I thought, this is crazy. So I remember from where I found mine to where Chuck found his was roughly one football field long. And I thought, oh my gosh, these things shatter. So inside the cannonball are these little lead balls. In my understanding, there's anywhere from 28, I think, to 32 or 34, something like that. But if these also hit you too, these things were violent. And we have, I don't know if we brought many bullets, but we have found tons of bullets. And but to me, everything it just has a story.
I always like to hear Joe talk, even though I've heard him talk a lot. I love his stories, and just hearing that his side of the stuff that they've found. And so I think it's all very interesting. This is from our book. We found the lost Sand Creek site. Butch Kelly visited a month later to look at bullets and other artifacts I found. Butch is a local historian and an Indian Wars cavalry reenactor. He portrayed a soldier in Sun in the Morning Star, a TV miniseries about George Custer and events prior to the Little Bighorn. He looked at a cavalry carbine swivel from a carbine belt, some spurs, a bit, and 3 or 4 things that could be identified as military, he said. Is there anything else? Butch said, after looking at hundreds of artifacts. Wasn't this enough? What more could he want? I had some 5-gallon buckets full of things like barbed wire, fence staples, round nails, and even a hubcap from a Model T Ford. Well, there was the piece of cast iron on the dash of my pickup. It didn't seem worth mentioning. I thought about putting it in my bucket of junk, but I didn't know for sure what it was, so there it stayed. And it sometimes bounced awkwardly, hitting the windshield. I went to go get it. There were some threads in it that could have had something like a pipe screwed in it. I handed it to him, thinking it was worthless. Do you know what this is? I had to admit I didn't. I thought it could be a broken piece of a windmill weight. The old windmills had counterbalance weights instead of tails that are common on them today. Some of the early weights were ornamental and looked like barnyard animals like horses, pigs, or cows. Some were just simple round balls. Perhaps the threads were where it screwed into the windmill. I'll tell you what this is. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. I was not prepared for what he would say next. I'm going to stop right there. And the rest of the story is in there. All right, well, thank you guys all for coming again today. Thank you for listening to us telling about finding the lost Sand Creek site. You can even learn a lot more in our book. You can learn a lot more also in our blogs on our website, thelostsandcreek.com. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Bowen History. You could go on to Amazon.com and get our book if you do. And also, you can also go to Amazon, even if you didn't get the book there. If you would please give us a written book review and rating on Amazon, we really would greatly appreciate it. It really does help us out, get this word out about the truth about this discovery and how that changes the story. So again, please give us a review and rating on Amazon.com for our book. So thank you so much for coming today. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you. We have a special guest with us today. My mom and dad did a tour back, I want to say around 2003-ish. About 2003, and they did a tour with the Order of Indian Wars tour, and this tour featured a man named Ed Bars. I don't know if you ever watched the History Channel or anything like that, if you're familiar with Ed Bars. We have a gentleman here with us today that was on that tour when we were providing Sand Creek tours, and you may have seen our hats that we're wearing. These are the hats that they sold and people got when they went to tours and when they did the tours out at Sand Creek years ago. But he's going to come share for just a few minutes of some memories he had.
Anyway, I'm Raymond Morris. I live up by Byers, but I'm kind of an amateur historian. In the book, there's I think it was 2003, Order of the Indian Wars group visited the site, and the Bowens were the most gracious hosts and so knowledgeable when we were there. But anyway, it was a group there were a few real professional historians in the group, but quite a few of us amateur historians. But they were so, and this was when it was just becoming known that this was not, that the site where the hill is down south, there's not the real site, and it was just the site where they came over and saw the village, which I'm always amazed. When I was thinking about it years before on finding the site, I thought, well, it might be south of there, because that covering 40 miles from Fort Lyon, and the first Fort Lyon site, in overnight was a pretty big feat, and a cold night, it seems like to me, and dragging howitzers with them and all that stuff was pretty big. I thought, well, if it's not at that site, it's maybe somewhere south on the creek south of there or something. But anyway, I really like what the Bowens have done, and it was really interesting for us to go out there when it was just first being discovered that was what the situation was anyway. if you have any other questions, please ask. I'm into a lot of local history stuff. So. Yeah, the leader of the group at that time was a man from Little Rock, Arkansas, who he engineered a lot of political campaigns for politicians and stuff. A guy named Jerry Russell, who's now passed away. And kind of the second in command of that group for a long time was a guy named Mike Corey, a little Texan that had a lot to say, but he lived in, he was, well, for a while he was a head of Old Army Press in Fort Collins. I think it originated in Nebraska somewhere and then went to Fort Collins, and that really doesn't exist anymore. And he lived in Johnstown for quite a while, but he's having quite some health problems himself now, and I think his wife has dementia and a bunch of problems. So we're all getting old that are interested in history, I guess. But anyway, several other historians, I'm trying to think who else were along. There were some other prominent historians, professional historians, PhD type people who were along on the trip. And I also know that you mentioned Doug Scott and Jerry Green, and I have sort of mixed emotions about them. They're great historians, but I'm not sure why, all the reasons why they don't, want to recognize the site and the situation as it is. But
do you agree with the place it is, that what we just said?
oh, the artifacts. I mean, these are definitely battle and village artifacts. There's no doubt about that. It was not a total massacre. The Indians definitely fought back, and it was a pretty serious battle. And so this is, historians and a lot of the Indians are overplaying what a massacre. They didn't just wipe out the Indians with no resistance, and they were not killing all women and children. There were warriors there too, and there were evidence in the camp, I think, from what we've read of, some of these there were a lot of raids during the summer of 1864 and fall, and there was evidence that the raiders were among this camp. It wasn't a totally peaceful camp waiting for the government to deal with them. The Indians had this warrior culture that they really couldn't refrain from their old ways of riding the plains, I think,